most of you, I know we have someone who knows a lot about the daguerreotypes, and there's many, many ways to talk about the history of photography. So I'll try to tell it as a story, and if there's something that doesn't make sense, or if you have a question, you can interrupt me. I'll keep it very conversational. So I wanted to start by asking you to imagine all of us here when we were born, photography was already old, right? It's not, for us, it doesn't amaze us to see a photograph, but imagine a time when there was no photography. There were sketches and drawings, but it wasn't possible to look at a picture of your great-great-grandfather and have a good sense of what he looks like, as we do with the photograph, even if you haven't met a person. And that's when Emily Howland was born in 1927. That was the case. There was no photography. And today's her birthday, so I think we all will have some cake afterwards to celebrate her birthday. So photography wasn't really invented in one single moment. There's various things were happening in the 19th century that led to that moment when we consider photography to be born. And so I'll spare you the many details, but I'll try to tell it my own way, what I think some of the key moments are, and I'll be missing some things. But we can't really talk about one inventor of photography or one first photograph. It's sort of an evolution. But the image you see here is what most people consider the first photograph. So what this is, this object is at Harry Ransom Center, and you'll see that as a conservator, I always think of a photograph not as an image but as an object. I think of it as the whole package, and this is very meaningful for cased photographs where we're talking really about objects. So if we took just the photograph that's on the daguerreotype, it wouldn't be the same level of care that we need to have for it, but even the same experience. So this is what we call the first photograph. It's at Harry Ransom Center in Texas in an argon enclosure, and what this is an object made in the year Emily Howland was born, 1927, and it took several days of exposure to get this image. The man who was doing this, Joseph Nicephore Niepce, is a Frenchman, and you'll notice that most of the first developments were made by what's called a gentleman amateur, someone with a lot of money and time and an interest in science. So science was a little bit an interest of the upper class, not necessarily of someone trying to make a business out of it. Niepce was trying to create a plate, and that makes sense why he was using metal plate. He was trying to find a way to take an image from nature and print it onto paper, so make essentially a printing plate from nature. And this is a pewter plate coated with bitumen that was exposed for many, many hours. I've been in this place actually. It's a courtyard of his house, and what you're seeing here is sort of like there's three buildings, and the shadow is traveling. So you kind of have, we don't see this as a photograph, but it's an image that was taken from nature by the action of light. And what the light did was it hardened some parts. The parts that were exposed to light hardened, and the other parts were dissolved away, were rinsed away. And that's why we equate this with photograph. Niepce didn't call it a photograph, he called it a heliograph. And at the same time, many, many other people knew that silver would darken when exposed to light. There's many, many factors coming together to create this process. So the two sort of more like fathers of photography that got closer to what we think as photography now were Niepce, Jean-Jacques Louis Daguerre, a Frenchman, who was sort of he had an artistic background, but he was really essentially kind of a businessman and an entertainer. So he made this thing called the diorama, where they would make these scenes on a stage and light would change and people would be, it was like going to the movies before there were movies. And he was interested in ways to project images, so he was looking at lenses, but he was looking also at the development in science of ways to make all this, in his case, somewhat profitable. So he wanted to make these big scenes fast, and he wanted to make a profit out of it. So that's Daguerre. And Daguerre was buying his lenses in the same place where Niepce was buying his lenses. So the man who was selling lenses to them had to put them together. And Niepce wasn't interested in working with Daguerre for the longest time, but eventually they did collaborate. And so after actually Niepce is older, Daguerre finally was able to make what we call now a daguerreotype. And he named it a daguerreotype. So that was the name he gave to his invention, and he wanted to make a money. He wanted to make a business out of it, and he mostly went. Daguerreotypes ended up being used to make portraits, which is a business. In England, you have this man, William Henry Fox Talbot, who was a semi-aristocratic a man more in the vein of the gentleman amateur I was telling you about, and he developed what he called the photogenic drawing, which was on a paper. So completely, if you think of these in terms of materiality, they're completely different. This is a paper, this is a piece of metal. So how we came to call them both photography is on the next step. So he created this process that's closer to photography that we knew as the negative and the positive. So for those of us who did darkroom, that's what photography was for a long time. Positive and the negative. And so this is on paper using silver, but it was really this man, John Herschel, who's a scientist who invented many, many things. One of the things he found out was the use of a chemical that dissolved silver, which is what those of us who did darkroom photography know as the fix. So when you put the black and white photograph on a fixer, it would dissolve all the light that wasn't exposed. And Herschel was the one who said, it doesn't matter if it's a negative or a positive or a paper, all these things are called photography. So he gave it more as a scientific prospect, and he created sort of this category that we think of as photography, rather than a daguerreotype, a photogenic drawing. So all of this umbrella is photography. And so from that point on, the paper negatives didn't really take off, except for gentlemen amateur people of aristocratic people who had a lot of time to do these experiments, whereas the daguerreotype really became a commercial enterprise. And most of photography's history, as you know, was moved by the drive of making money, making a profit. So we had portrait photography. People didn't really want to see pictures of haystacks. People want to see their own picture. They want to send their photograph to their boyfriend, things like that. So that's why photography became so expansive, was in this commercial enterprise. And this is where our cased objects come in. So photography was announced to the world in France in the beginning of 1839 by Daguerre. Niepce was dead at that time. And Daguerre, in the beginning, he tried to sell subscriptions to these, to his method. He didn't give it away immediately. But at the time, there was a lot of competition with scientific developments and all sorts of developments, especially between France and England. There was a lot of rivalry. And the French government thought this was such a breakthrough of a discovery that they wanted to make this public. So what they did was they struck a deal with Daguerre. The French government bought the patent, the rights to disseminate how this was made, and they gave Daguerre a lifelong pension. So he didn't have to worry for money for the rest of his life. And so this was announced in the beginning of 1839 at an international fair. And Samuel Morse was there to show his invention, the telegraph, which he thought was going to be mic drop, right? No one could beat the telegraph. Well, all everybody could talk about was the invention of photography, right? Because someone finally was able to make an image from nature. And so Morse came back to America, and he brought these news very early on. And in Philadelphia, there was a man who was contacted because the daguerreotype is a copper plate with silver on top. And so that's what you need to make a daguerreotype. So this man, Robert Cornelius, was a metal worker, and he was contacted to sell plates for people to make daguerreotypes. Well, he started to make daguerreotypes himself. And what you see here is the first self-portrait that is known. I mean, there might be others, but this is considered the first self-portrait in history, and that's him. That's Robert Cornelius. He went to his studio rooftop and made this portrait himself. That's the lore. He established a studio, Cornelius did, and he immediately, in 1839, made the first big development technologically to the daguerreotype, which was, the daguerreotype used to be just based in silver iodide, and he and a colleague started using bromide, which made it a lot more not just resistant, but also enhanced. So I'll show pictures of that a little bit later on. I wanted to focus now on the presentation aspect. So the daguerreotypes, in the beginning, they were presented as sort of like as artwork, so they would be framed in France for the longest time. They continued to be presented on this passepartout. And the case object which we are focusing on now really is an American invention. So here are two examples of what we call typically French daguerreotypes. They are presented like this. They have this reverse paint glass passepartout, whereas in America, very early on, cases started to be used to house the daguerreotypes. And these two are by Robert Cornelius. So the one on the left is on a frame, and you see a case. And early cases you'll see, and we'll look at this more further down, but the earlier the case, the simpler it is, the case and the window mat, and we can go through these examples later on. But if it's very, very simplified, that there's no embossing, decoration, that would be one of the signs that you're looking at an early plate. So here we have Emily Howland, her timeline at the top, and a little bit of photography history at the bottom. Photography, like I said, even though it starts often with science and arts and that sort of discovery, it very quickly is harnessed to the commercial aspect of things. So a lot of the dates in photography are moved by the consumer market. So, Emily and the first photograph are both born in 1927, and then we have what we call the cased images period. So Emily, this is a daguerreotype of Emily Howland, probably age 21. And these are later images of her. So at this point, we are looking at paper-based photography. I'm not going to talk about that today. So we're just going to talk about the cased images period, which would be daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and tintypes. And in America, it's really, photography is very linked to, I'm Portugal born, but I'm an American now. And our history in America is very linked to photography. We can mirror our identity in actual photographic objects, and you don't have, so photography, it feels to me it's much more important in America than it might be to other countries, because it's tied to the Civil War and to all these figures of which you can have a photographic reference. And so these are cased images, we're going to talk about that. And then we have albumen prints, which are, you can have tintypes and albumen prints at the same time, but these are the periods of provenance of these methods. Then you have the black and white plates, the black and white film, and then the color period. And they kind of go in 20-year increments. So this idea of the case, where does this typology of the case come from? Where miniatures, this idea of having a small handheld object that's a miniature portrait of your loved one or someone meaningful, comes really from, it's much older than the photograph. So these are examples of 17th century ivory portrait miniatures that they would have this typology of being inside a case. And here's another example of that. This is an 18th century painting that shows you how the upper classes would have these portraits made. They're very expensive. So when the daguerreotype takes off as this commercial thing that you could sit for a portrait, have your picture taken, it adopts that typology. And in fact, a lot of the cases will even say miniatures. And this one's by Cornelius that we just talked about. So that's where we're borrowing this imagery from. And cases as a type of object there can be found in many things, in many precious things that you might find, from technical objects to love letters. So it's a way to make an object more precious and more personal and intimate. And in fact, the six-plate cased object really is, when you open these cases, there's photographs you have on a wall that you're walking around your house and you stumble upon them if your eye catches the photograph. With a cased object, you really need to want to see that. So it's a private moment that you choose to take a moment to look at that case. So that's part of the beauty and the attraction of these cases still for us today. And making cases was a real business. So like I said, photography became a business very early on. It wasn't cheap to get your photograph taken necessarily, but more and more people, you know, it was fairly accessible, certainly when the collodion period started. So you can see that this was, there are thousands of cases, millions of photographs being done by the late 1840s, certainly. And not everybody bought a case, so you know, the photograph to get your daguerreotype taken, it might have been 10 cents, and then the case would cost you $1, right, or $2. So the cases would be like, you know, when you go buy a coffin or something like that. You know, you can buy the very expensive coffin, you can buy the cardboard box or something in between. So not all cases were the same, and you were given a choice, so you could certainly just buy your plate without a case, but most people would certainly opt for having a case. And this is the gilding, so you could have very elaborate constructions. And when you look at a daguerreotype, I mean, it really does something for the image, right? If you were, and you know, you pick up an object and you hold it in your hand like that, it's not the same thing, right? You want to give it this presentation, which makes it, you know, much more interesting object. And to set the scene a little bit, what would it be like to have your photograph taken? A lot of people say that people didn't smile in those days. Well, apart from the fact that you had to sit for a little bit, you know, a few seconds, it was kind of scary. Imagine never having your picture taken, being this little girl, and you're asked to sit here in front of this strange looking thing. You don't know what's happening, right? So that's oftentimes, so this is what you would be presented with at a photographer's studio. And this is a modern version of this. This is a studio in Rochester, New York, of Mark Osterman, he's a collodion artist, and he really excels in every historic process you can think of. So oftentimes the studio would be painted in this sort of tone because of the way it reflected the sensitive material has a certain perception of even if it's in black and white, it has a certain perception of the spectrum. And you'd be placed with this headrest, so you wouldn't move. You wouldn't, so your picture would be in focus. And many photographs would be taken at significant moments in someone's life, so a birthday or a wedding, or if you were betrothed to someone, or if you got a new sewing machine, or you know, you wouldn't take several pictures throughout your life. Most likely you'd have maybe 1-2 portraits made, and you might have seen there's portraits of dead children, post-mortem portraits that they look like they're asleep, so that shows you that it was a way to keep the portrait of that person was the one photograph you took. And it's kind of interesting to look at these images and try to understand what's being told. So sometimes you might be someone passed away, so it's a widower with the portrait of her husband.
Wow.
And we haven't talked about exactly what the daguerreotype is. What does it look like? This is an extraordinary daguerreotype that we have very close by in the Madison County Historical Society of the Fugitive Slave Law Convention in Cazenovia. The photographer who took this picture was a local photographer who was there, and these are very, very rare. I mean, something like this one happens to be on the case. It's a quarter plate. Most portraits you'll have really are of, you know, sitting portraits. There's very few that survive that are landscapes or things of this nature. There's Frederick Douglass and the Edmondson sisters in plaid. It's an amazing plate. So the daguerreotype, we show you like this in a PowerPoint, but it's really a mirror, and it's kind of hard to get used to seeing yourself. When you look in cross section, like I said, the daguerreotype is a copper plate that's plated with silver, and then the image is made of mercury and silver amalgam. And so they can be both negative and positive. To get the positive view that you have here, you really need to be inside a completely black environment. Otherwise, it will reflect You'll reflect the negative or reflect yourself, and that's part of why what the case is doing. The left side of the case is typically a dark color, so when you hold it in your hand, you either your clothes will be dark and will help you, or you use the case to kind of reflect back the darkness to be able to see the positive. And this is how you can take a picture of the negative view. You need to put a sort of a glass in front of your camera, and it photographs through here, and then you shine a light here. So it's a little bit of a contraption, but it is possible to do. And the daguerreotypes were really extraordinary things. I mean, this is a whole plate which is about this size from the Cincinnati library. It's this big panorama, and you can really zoom in. So that's 8 times. That's 80 times. It's just remarkable things. And so in terms of evolution of the process itself, like I said, this would be your first the method that the daguerreotype invented. So it was just an iodide sensitized plate. They kind of look like this. They look very sort of flat. And if you rub your finger through the image, it would rub right off. I mean, this one is one that I made. It was freshly made. This one, the daguerreotype one, if you rubbed it, it probably wouldn't come right off like that, because it would have been a better exposure. It's been there for 200 years. But they're very it's sort of a light image on the surface. And then the next process that I told you about, that Cornelius developed, adding the bromine. So these are a little bit sturdier of a process. And then another development that was introduced was something called gilding. So whereas the first daguerreotypes were made just with sensitizing the silver with iodide, making it light sensitive. Then the bromine was added, and then this final step was added of doing a gold chloride bath. And this helped not just with making the image layer stronger, but it also helped with making it more contrasty. So in the United States, I'd say that the highest quality of the daguerreotypes was achieved by these two photographers, Southard and Hawes in Boston, and their plates are just really extraordinary things. They photographed a lot of the most relevant society in the 1850s. They developed a method of, the inside of their camera was white, so the cameras in these times, they were really just boxes and they had a lens. But by making the inside of the camera white, it bounced light more. They also improved the lighting in the studios where they photographed people, and they did a lot of this silver toning and gold toning. And so this gold toning, if you push it too far, and I'll show you further on, it can actually cause damage because it starts to lift off from the silver base. So after the daguerreotype, the process that came after it was all the wet collodion processes. And wet collodion, I'll show you some pictures, is a method of coating a glass plate with collodion and then making it sensitive to silver. And then you take a picture. And with the collodion, you could do two things. You can make a negative that you print onto albumen. So a lot of the albumen prints that many of you will have in your family albums, those very faint sort of slightly yellow things, like this sort of thing you probably saw in your own collections. This would be an albumen print, and this would use collodion negative, which is a glass negative. The collodion negative, the image would be sort of like a milky yellow. So if you put something black behind it, it appears as positive. So that's what an ambrotype is. This one is an ambrotype on a ruby glass, and we saw a few of you brought your own ambrotypes, and you can, if you take your ambrotype out of the case, which there's risks involved with taking something out of the case, so I caution you to do it properly. I brought a tool here that you can see. This a suction cup that you can it helps with pulling it out, and if you put it against a light table, you'll see that it's a red background. But not all of them are like this. Some of them had painted, the back is painted black, and some of them have sort of a velvet in the back. So there's many ways. The bottom line is if you put a black background with this yellowish white image, you'll get a positive. So that's the collodion. So the ambrotype, so this is an ambrotype, and also the tintypes were made the same way, except they were on an iron sheet, sort of an iron-based backing, and I have some examples. So it's an actual piece of metal. So this is just another example of an amber type. And so when they're cased, I was mentioning to someone earlier, amber types were often placed in a case, and they look much like a daguerreotype, even down to the sizes that were used. Because as we saw, making cases was sort of big business. So you have these standard sizes. It just became an industry, right? So oftentimes, and that's what I hope you'll leave today with understanding, is they look the same, but they're essentially different things. So this would be a daguerreotype, which will always look like a mirror. Some of them can get very, very tarnished. I mean, I have examples here, and when it's so tarnished, you can't even see the photograph. It looks like it's not even there. But there's these few things that I can tell. So if you take it out, if you see it's glass, typically if you turn the back of a daguerreotype, you'll see the copper. So there's ways to kind of get to the distinction between the two of them, but they're very, very similar, the two of them. So amber type, daguerreotype. The tin types, they're less common. It's less common that you would have them in a case. So tin types were later than the amber types, when they started to coat these iron sheet with collodion. And tin types, you often find them, if you went to the beach, or they'd be very, very cheaply made. You could make a tin type very cheaply, and you start having this sort of very goofy. You can find very interesting tin types because they're so cheap. You can do it more like you would. What's that machine called that would do the photographs, right? That when you went with your girlfriends to the fair, and everybody gets it. So because it's cheap, it's kind of fun, and they're very, very common. There's tons of these out in the world. And typically, the cheapest thing you would do is get them in this slip case. And still today, you'll buy them. I mean, I buy them off of eBay, and they still come in this sort of case. But there was what's called the Neff patented tin type. It's essentially the same thing, but it was put in the case. So this was the tin type, and it could fool you because it's so beautiful. It's not a seaside picture. Definitely not a seaside picture. So it's not to say you cannot have a tin type on a case. You definitely can. And to tell a tin type, some of the ways you can do it is, I showed some people earlier, these are magnetic, so you want to be careful because, you don't want to just smash a magnet, but, they will attach to a magnet, so that's one way to be able to tell if you have them in a case. I mean, ideally, you'd probably have to take them off. Oftentimes, they'll have corrosion in the back, so if you have something like this, that would be a tin type, because that's the metal corroding. And I have some pictures here of Mark Osterman doing white collodion. So the white collodion would be for the amber type and the tin type, same method. You pour collodion on a very clean glass, and then it goes into a bath. It gets sensitized, and it goes into your backing. And then it's developed, and you get this sort of like yellowish color photograph. And I have had my collodion taken. I have had two types of my this. Now there's more and more people doing this sort of photography. It's not complicated. It's a fairly simple thing you could do in your house, but it is a real treat to have it. And as you see, so tin types, oftentimes the camera would have multiple lenses, so you'd take 4, and then you just clip them like you would with your friend at the fair, right? Everybody takes one home, and you put it on the wall. This one here, I actually brought it with me. It's kind of cool. It's something I bought on eBay, but it was all delaminating. So you can actually see all the layers of the tin type. So that's the metal backing and the actual emulsion separated off. And collodion is a plastic, so it won't shrink and expand. Whereas if you think of an albumin print or a gelatin print, those shrink and expand with moisture. The collodion is plastic. It won't shrink and expand. I mean, most of you have tried new skin. It's just like it doesn't move. So it just peeled right off of the backing. So this would be the structure of any case. So you have the case, and then you have your photograph, which in this case would be these two. And then you have some sort of a backing, not always. And then a glass, a brass mat, and then this is called a brass preserver that kind of clamps it all into place. And then it goes into the case. Another variation that happened too, and this we're looking at the collodion era, so photography was people were fairly comfortable with photography after it being around 20 years. I mean, it's a bit like us. 20 years when we think 19th century is not a lot of time, but think of us with our iPhones. I mean, I didn't have an iPhone 20 years ago, so things evolved just as rapidly as they do today. So with the tintype, one thing that was very popular was, well, not just tintype, there's photographic jewelry, there's, I brought an ambrotype jewelry, so those would exist, but then tintype jewelry became fairly accessible and cheap. And of course, Lincoln was the first president to really use photography as a campaign tool. So people would buy these buttons and wear them, and you can find them, there's a lot of them around. And Lincoln was a very handsome, photogenic man, so he really was the first politician to use that sort of charisma, visual charisma, to gain popularity, and rightly so.
Luisa, is that
Yep.
is that a tintype of Lincoln? Or
That's a
is that,
tintype, no.
so he handed that out for a contribution or something?
Yeah, so you'd buy them, or they're little tiny things. They're great. They come up for sale.
Huh. How big are they?
Huh?
How big? Like a
They're
quarter?
the size of a coin. Yeah,
Yeah.
They're tiny. Yeah.
Huh.
So here we are. There's lots of cases around the world. There was millions of these. In the beginning, when people started collecting photography, a lot of the times they would just want the cases. So people would just trash what was inside and sell the case. And oftentimes when you buy these, they're not necessarily on the case they came in. So it's very common if you go to antique fairs, they'll say, you want that case? They'll just switch it in front of you, which makes conservators horrified. But, you should never assume that, unless with the Howland daguerreotypes, we know they stayed in the family, so they're probably the original ones. With things out in the market, it's possible that they're not. So don't assume that if you find a date that it matches, these things get moved around. And they did their job protecting these objects quite a bit from many things. So this is a colleague of mine made this structure. I mean, there's a lot goes into making a case, right? And there's a lot that can break and get damaged in your collections. There's a lot that you could address. So I'll just show you some of the things that you can do. So, for example, with tintypes, if they're not in a case, they can just get bent. So like you see it in that plate, and when they get bent, oftentimes the image will just pop off. Ideally, a case would protect from breakage, but it didn't in these two cases. So this is something that can happen to ambrotypes, as the support itself gets broken. And then, as I said, the collodion and even the backing black paints that was used, they're on glass, and all these things kind of age differently, right? So it's not uncommon to see this sort of deterioration where things just start to pop off. And in this case, there's some things that conservators can do to consolidate, so that you have this very thin, flaking thing. But it's fairly limited, and you're introducing new material. So with photography, preservation of your photographic collection, a lot of the things you need to do are preventive. So prevent them from getting worse, that sort of thing. Because it's a technology that's made by a machine, it's very hard for a conservator with little brush stroke. It's not the same as with a painting where you can take off a varnish, put it again, because it was made by hand and it's being treated by hand. So it's very challenging. All these materials are machine produced, a lot of them, and the image certainly is not made by hand. But we can do some things to stabilize, and as caretakers of your own collection, oftentimes you can just think, maybe I can't take it back to where it was, but there are ways to kind of freeze it where it is now. So 100 years from now, people will say, well, it didn't get worse than it was. One of the elements that very frequently gets deteriorated is the glass, so either the cover glass or the backing glass. I don't know how many of you have been to Corning, to the museum, but it is, it seems very unchangeable, but it's something that can deteriorate very significantly. So one of the things that can happen with glass is this deterioration called whipping glass. It's just salts from the silica start coming to the surface, and then as any salt, they absorb and desorb water. So some of these are so the salts are so much accumulated they they're actually liquid on the surface of the glass. There can also be sort of dirt trapped in the glass that then interacts with your photograph. So although conservators, for the most part, we want to keep all the original materials, there are some situations where a case can be made to take out the original glass and put a new, there's this sort of borosilicate glass, a bit like Pyrex, that won't change, hopefully. There are trade-offs. And look at this example. I mean, the plate, once the glass was changed, I mean, it looks like a huge transformation, when in fact all they did was change the glass. Other forms of deterioration that can happen are tarnish. So daguerreotypes are like any silver object, and you know from your own collections or from movies, whatever, that silver typically was cleaned at least once a year. Now you can't do that with a daguerreotype, unfortunately, but you do have the same type of corrosion. And in fact, in the beginning, conservation of photography really started with photographers doing things to photographs. And so some of the first treatments very early on, these daguerreotypes started to tarnish, and people would do things like cyanide cleaning, and then there was another type of cleaning that came from the silver dips, which was a thiourea cleaning, and all these made the daguerreotypes look great when they were cleaned, but then 10 years on started causing deterioration, be it by interaction with the materials on the photograph, but also if you didn't wash them properly. So some of these daguerreotypes are very, very tarnished, like this one here, and this is just an interesting direction that science has gone. You know, conservators, we do a lot of, apart from our bench work, we do a lot of research, and this is the research that was done, that they imaged this plate with something called a synchrotron that does elemental mapping, and they were able to get the this image, even though these are other elements, right? So that's the mercury layer, layer of the imaging. You can see the photograph again without any treatment. It's not as satisfactory as something that you would watch the actual thing, but you know, you can see the image that's there, so that's kind of neat. Scratching obviously is a big part of a condition issue with the daguerreotypes, because it's very thin. They had to be very, very polished to get that glass-like final sheen. I've made a daguerreotype myself, and let me tell you, the polishing is grueling. I mean, you can see it's very, very hard to polish. You'd be surprised. I mean, silver is just so soft. There are many steps of polishing, and even so, it's actually here, the one that I made, and if you tilt it, you can see the polish marks. And this one, obviously, it's damage that was caused later on. So the case is also protecting from that.
Luisa,
yeah.
So on a daguerreotype, the glass, the exterior of the glass, if you have a dirty, without even getting into the silver plate, what do you do to clean it?
Well, you can clean it. So with the daguerreotype, I mean, you kind of need to look at it first. So typically the daguerreotypes, most of them have like a paper tape around it. Right. The way to clean glass really has to involve some kind of a solvent, some kind of moisture. And so ideally you'd use sort of like a microfiber cloth that's a little bit damp, and you can sort of buff it up. But you want to be careful not to get any of that dampness onto your tape that can like soak in and get moisture trapped on the sides. I know conservators, we sound crazy because it's like, oh, would it really get, but we've looked at these things very up close, and we've seen damage of things that you wouldn't believe something so small could cause so much damage. So yeah, it's just being very careful and keeping things very dry. I mean, it is a metal that you want to keep from corroding, but you can clean it and buff it up with a microfiber cloth. You might need a little bit of moisture, because sometimes it's just not going to happen if you just do it dry, and you're just going to cause abrasion. It's a little bit like your glasses, I suppose, your reading glasses. I wouldn't use any of those solvents. I'd probably just try like distilled water or something like that. Yeah. And this one is interesting to look at. It's just photographing the same object with a different angle of camera. Look at the difference. Nothing has been done to this other than the angle of photography. So this was done on a scanner where the light kind of would scatter all the surface. Well, there was some texture, and there was some damage too. And this is on a copy stand. So just by imaging it, just by the way, and if you had it in your hand, just the way you tilt it or angle it might make a huge difference. So I mentioned earlier that there was the advance of the gilding of the plates, and this really made the Southward and Hawes, this is another Southward and Hawes plate, look amazing, but it's probably what caused this thing that is called exfoliation. And you don't see this except if you're looking in a microscope or a very strong microscope, but it will keep happening over time. So eventually you have something on display and it's just sort of gone, or a big flake came off of it. So that's what's happening. So this is an example of a cleaning. Where I trained at the Eastman House, we were taught to make all these cleaning methods that you shouldn't do anymore, but it's good to know why people love them so much. I mean, this is fantastic. This is a plate that was cleaned with thiourea. So imagine getting from this to that, it's great, but you're gonna have a lot of damage 10 years from now on this plate. Things that can happen with this method are formation of what they call measles, which are actual brown spots that form. And there might be other types of pitting that occur to the plate over time. This is an example of something that was cyanide cleaned. You can't see it from just looking at it, but cyanide cleaned plates will fluoresce in this way with UVC light. There's other, cyanide could also be present in a plate because of the way it was plated. There's a couple of other ways cyanide could get in, but not this type of, this is all cyanide residue from cyanide cleaning most likely. Yeah, so it's interesting to see. So the way conservators now treat daguerreotypes is, there's a couple of ways. I, for example, even though I've learned these methods, I wouldn't be comfortable cleaning one except if it was completely necessary. So I've done it, maybe it's like you don't want to go to a surgeon and get a heart surgery for someone who did it once, right? So I'd have to, I mean, I would never do something to an object if I wasn't comfortable with. I might do some tests, but I would probably send you to colleagues who've done it a lot more. So there's some people who do this method as an electrocleaning method. I've tested it. It's kind of scary because it can go wrong. So it can be wonderful, but it can something that just like I saw it happen. Like a black spot just forms and there's no taking it out. So things like that. So something I would be comfortable with is what we call an ammonia cleaning, which is a very, very gentle cleaning that it takes away a little bit of the tarnish, but it doesn't do all that much. And at that point you think, well, is it really worth doing it if it's not going to do all that much? Unless there's visible, say there's a bug on the surface that really needs something stronger than just air. So yes, it's quite limited what a conservator can do, but my encouragement to you is doing things that will halt duration now. 100 years from now, I'll be happy you did it, even though it doesn't take it back to where it was before. A lot of things that conservators will propose when treating a daguerreotype has to do with housing. So it's a metal object. It really wants to be away from moisture. So this is, typically we do housings that involve some kind of aluminum backing or something like that. I did research on anoxia applied to autochromes, completely different animal than the daguerreotype, but I am a big proponent of trying anoxic methods. Taking out the oxygen reduces a lot of these physical, chemical processes of deterioration. This is a colleague of mine, Ralph Wiegand, who is based in Rochester. Sorry, this slide looks weird. I think it doubled itself. So he developed a method that's actually commercially available of this anoxic housing. It seems overkill, but he did tests and it slows down the rate of damage so much. So something like the Emily Howland plate, this one here, might be a good candidate because it's such a unique, you want 100 years from now people to be able, little girls to be able to see this beautiful plate. So this is something that, it's an investment, but it's something that, you're kind of stopping what's happening from getting any worse. And for people like ourselves in our own collection, I mean, it's really a matter of finding appropriate housing that's, right for the size. So you can either make your own housing or you can purchase things already made. There's several, I can advise you several archival distribution centers. When you're dealing with photographs, you want to look for something that says that it passed the PAT, which is the Photographic Activity Test, which is a test they do at the Image Permanence Institute in Rochester, and they basically see if a material reacts to silver or not. And so you know that if it passed that test, it's inert, it's safe to use, it's not going to off-gas. Many of us had bad experiences in the 80s when you get some housing and then everything turns yellow in your photograph, and that's what it is, off-gassing. adhesives or acids in the paper. So you really want to look for something that passed the PAT, but it doesn't cost an arm and a leg. You'd be surprised. I mean, it's often not more expensive than going to Staples and getting a box there. So it's just a matter of finding the right thing with the right, testing. So yes, you can buy them pre-made, or you can make your own, buy stock material. There's instructions online, and I'm going to leave my email at the end. Our advice is free, so you can pick up the phone anytime. If it's an institution, if it's a private, we always advise where you can find something. You can email us a picture, so we're happy to help. This is just another example. I mean, these cases can get very complicated. This is a very custom case of something that's split in half, and instead of mending the joint, they decided to sort of keep it separate. So you can get very creative with ways to house something without having to intervene, but they can definitely be mended and glued. And here's an example of a case where you can kind of cut out this foam material to get your cased objects in. This is just to show you in terms of handling. My preference is to use nitrile gloves if I'm handling something like this. They're very thin and they give you a good sense of the grip, so you're not going to drop your object. So that's what most conservators use. I'll stay away from those cotton gloves. They do nothing really. They transfer dirt, and they make you lose your sense of dexterity. So most conservators will use the nitrile gloves, and that's my contact. And I brought a bunch of things here for you to see that we can talk about. So I kept it very, very light on the on the science and things like that. But please ask me questions, and we can go back on slides. Thank you.